Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the show. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. We have a great show for you today, so hit that like button as you come on. Despite a so-called peace offensive, quote unquote, culminating in the Putin-Alaska summit, a Putin-Trump-Alaska summit, the war in Ukraine keeps on escalating. Russia just launched its second biggest missile attack in and around Kiev in recent days and is making even more breakthroughs on the battlefield. Russian forces have made gains in Dnepropetrovsk, and none of Trump's peace efforts, quote unquote, have swayed Vladimir Putin to let up. And it keeps on getting worse for U.S. hegemony. Russia and China are preparing for a broader war with the United States in more ways than one, as new naval drills between the two countries erupt ahead of China's Victory Day celebration to end World War II. To discuss all this and more, I have a friend of the show, Brian Berletic of the new Atlas. Thank you, Brian, for coming on. We're just missing KJ No. We'll keep a lookout for him as he deals with some technical issues. But Brian, good to be with you.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Of course. Again, everyone hit the like button. That helps boost the stream in YouTube's algorithm. So, Brian, I wanted to talk about, we had the United States, NATO. Now Trump is saying he's very mad again at Vladimir Putin for this huge missile attack that has occurred in recent days. We have Europe losing its mind. The attack was the second biggest one in the conflict, 629 aerial weapons overall, a huge number of drone-type drones, 598. You had Kinjal missiles being launched, Iskanders, cruise missiles. So many targets were hit from the Ukrspreks system, Samsung in Ukraine. You have Kiev radio plant. So many targets, Brian, and all of them point to Ukraine, the Ukrainian military's industrial base. So first, I just wanted to show and have you react to what does this mean in the midst of what we have just witnessed with the restart of talks between the United States and Russia? Because it sends a pretty strong message that, and this was the scene during that attack, just an absolute barrage on Ukraine. So what does this say about where things are at given this so-called restart of talks?
Well, I think it demonstrates Russia's, and I think correct understanding of this process of talk. This is obviously just another attempt by the United States to implement some sort of Minsk I, Minsk II freeze of the conflict. This is what they literally said publicly. I go over this every single time we talk about this topic. U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, all the way back in February, at the very beginning of the Trump administration, talking about freezing the conflict, not ending it, freezing it, sending in European and non-European troops, not American troops, into Ukraine to do a kind of Minsk I, Minsk II plus Syria-style freeze of the conflict. So the United States could pivot east and attack Russia's ally, China. And then once they're done trying to contain or roll back China's rise, they will come back and they will deal with Russia later. And they call this strategic sequencing. And this is all out in the open, public. Everybody knows this. Russia knows this. This is why Russia isn't taking any of this seriously. They're being polite. They're going to these talks. They're committing to absolutely nothing. They've made no concessions whatsoever. And they continue with the war on the ground. And this is not a war on Ukraine. This is a war that the U.S. is fighting against Russia simply through Ukraine. And just to remind people, it isn't that the United States is just supporting the Ukrainians in all of this. The United States is literally overseeing every single aspect of this conflict. There are U.S. generals in Germany right now running the entire war, from the overall strategic picture down to picking individual targets on the battlefield. We were just talking about this before we went live. We were talking about how President Trump has so graciously demanded that the Ukrainians not carry out any long-range strikes on Russia. The purpose of this wasn't because President Trump is fundamentally against striking at Russia because he wants to end the conflict. It was, as he himself said, to encourage talks and essentially to trick the Russians into yet another Minsk-style ceasefire or freeze. And because that isn't working, we've seen the Trump administration simultaneously begin the process of arming Ukraine with more long-range weapons. And eventually they're going to take that limit off the use of Western missiles to attack Russian targets. And I was just watching reports about Ukrainian Neptune missiles. These are long-range missiles supposedly built by Ukraine, although obviously with NATO, US help. And they were trying to target the Crimean Bridge again. And there were US reconnaissance aircraft flying over the Black Sea for days, preparing this attack. And so it's literally the United States picking the target, providing all of the information for Ukraine, and Ukraine simply just pushing the button to carry out these strikes. Now, again, as usual, Russia's air defense, missile defense systems stopped this attack on the bridge, and nothing became of it. But this is the Trump administration pretending to stop long-range missile strikes on Russia while actually still carrying them out while preparing for additional strikes. So Russia sees straight through this. That is why the war continues. This is a war that needs to be settled on the battlefield, and that is what Russia is doing.
Yes, and KJ is here. KJ, good to see you. I'll kick it to you now, and I'll just pull up to just catch you up what we were just discussing. It's this huge missile attack that has Europe absolutely angry. Now Trump is saying he is angry at Russia for this missile attack. Now, Russia has never said that it was going to cease hostilities. The war continues to escalate, hundreds of aerial weapons used in this. Your reaction to where things are at, KJ, and what the significance of this stage of the conflict is and wherever you want to take it, larger sense.
Well, I think, as Brian said, this is a war that is going to be decided on the battlefield. The Russians are undeceived. They're not going to fall in for, the salesman talk, the Minsk 3, whatever you have it. So they're perfectly aware of, what is going to happen. It's going to be decided on the battlefield, and they have, overwhelming strength. Certainly they have the overwhelming tactical, strategic, and industrial capacity to overwhelm the Ukrainians. And they're starting to Swiss cheese the front lines, as well as have these standoff, immense standoff attacks. So I think all of this is fairly clear, but I think the interesting spin here is the way that the US is reacting with extreme frustration and lashing out at its quote unquote so-called allies. And what I mean by that is, most recently, Peter Navarro calling the Ukraine war Modi's war, essentially India saying, it's our sovereignty. We buy oil from who we want. You don't have to buy from us, but we're going to buy and sell who we want to. And Navarro is blaming the Indians for, the Ukraine war. He says it's a laundromat for the Kremlin. And, in the high-ranking, elite circles, Ashley Tellis says that, Trump has done more to push India and China and Russia together than any other president, in history. In fact, cynically or sardonically, I think he's saying that Trump has done more for peace than any other president, because he essentially created a coalition that is not that was not supposed to happen. And currently, I'm sure that Eli Ratner, who is the undersecretary for policy at the Department of Defense, is probably pulling out his hair at the Marathon Institute, because India was supposed to be the manufacturing, it was supposed to be the secure and safe military manufacturing and subcontracting hub. And now Trump has, thrown that out the window. Essentially, the logic here being that, when the bully gets frustrated, the first person that he's going to pick on is his sidekick, and India is the most closest and convenient sidekick to beat up on. So this is all to say that, things are not going well for the United States, and that whatever the US is trying to achieve is also being thwarted by its own lack of strategic understanding and diplomatic skill.
Yeah, Brian, talk about the significance of this breakthrough into Dnepropetrovsk. What does that mean now to this calculus, not only that KJ laid out, but also in the reactions to what Russia has said from the very beginning? It's not going to necessarily let up just because talks are happening. Actually, one of the things that did come out of the so-called Alaska summit was that there was not going to be an immediate ceasefire, that there would be only a peace deal sometime in the future. So what do you make of this breakthrough on the battlefield, and what you expect moving forward?
Well, it has to be remembered that there wouldn't be any talks at all with the United States if Russia wasn't advancing on the battlefield. Does anybody remember the United States offering anyone talks when their terrorist proxies were advancing on the battlefield in Syria late last year? I don't remember that. So the only reason why they're engaged in talks in the first place is because the situation on the battlefield has become so critical in terms of these U.S.-backed Ukrainian proxies. It's not just a breakthrough there are breakthroughs taking place all along the line of contact. And what people have to remember is that this isn't really an attempt by Russia to break through and sweep across the battlefields like blitzkrieg or something like this. This is a war of attrition. And what we're watching is Ukrainian lines, even in the most heavily defended places that have been built up defensively for years and years, they're just crumbling. There's not enough manpower. We have all been covering this for at least the last 1 or 2 years, how critical the manpower shortage specifically has become. And what people don't understand is when you hear U.S. Western experts talking about reconstituting Ukraine's forces, rebuilding brigades, you cannot do something like that overnight. A brigade is not just 4,000 men trained, going through basic training, and then showing up on the battlefield. The brigade has units, subunits, and they need to be commanded by someone. Those commanders require, or leaders like non-commissioned officers, they require years of experience and training that simply cannot be done in the time frame that is now forced upon Ukraine and its backers right now. So that's what we're watching. This is crumbling. Just like the situation in Syria, we still have Western experts saying, "Oh, look at how slowly Russia is advancing at this rate. They'll be in Kiev by 2150, something like that." But in reality, it is increasing exponentially. So the rate that they're advancing right now is much, much faster than last year. And by next year, if this all continues, it'll be greater still. And there will be, and we don't know when, there will be a breaking point where the line just completely collapses. Ukraine's fighting capacity collapses, and that is when Russia may possibly have an opportunity to take territory that right now seems inconceivable. Odessa, maybe, Nikolaev, Kharkov, Sumy, things like this. So this is what we have to keep an eye on. This is what has created this sense of urgency in Washington and in Brussels, also London. London and Brussels are essentially the same thing. And that is why the U.S. is pressing so hard for a freeze. There's no interest at all in peace. They want to raise the cost as high as possible for Russia and keep this going as long as possible.
Speaking of pressing, KJ, I wanted to play this because you always bring it back to the bigger picture. And there is a lot of pressing toward, especially pushing the United States to then push in the Western mainstream media, NBC here, is really panicking. They really want Putin and Zelensky to meet. They want this conflict frozen. Here is what NBC News did with J.D. Vance and what he had to say about this question of whether Russia is stringing the United States along.
Trump along?
No, not at all, Kristen. I think the Russians have made significant concessions to President Trump for the first time in 3.5 years of this conflict. They've actually been willing to be flexible on some of their core demands. They've talked about what would be necessary to end the war. Of course, they haven't been completely there yet, or the war would be over, but we're engaging in this diplomatic process in good faith. We are trying to negotiate as much as we can with both the Russians and the Ukrainians to find a middle ground to stop the killing.
So that was his answer. That was JD Vance's answer, KJ. But the panic is that there is a question of whether Russia is stringing the United States along. What are your thoughts on this based on where things are here?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and never believe anything until it's been officially denied. So I think in this situation, I think they really are worried. As Brian said, Russia is clearly winning on the battlefield. This is the US's war to lose. They've run out of manpower. There's only so many people you can Shanghai in the streets. We know the enormous losses that have now been leaked. And you just simply cannot sustain a military with, losing, hundreds of divisions of manpower. And so at this point, they're actually keeping women in the military who are, pregnant in their third trimester. I mean, that is a complete sign of desperation. Of course, it goes back to this original idea that they were going to bleed Russia out on the battlefield. Ukraine was going to be this bloodletting table, and they were just going to bleed Russia out on the way to China, because Russia was, a gas station, and essentially it was just an appetizer before they moved on to the main dish, which was supposed to be China. Well, the appetizer turned out to be flounder, and they're choking on the bones. They're not going much further, although they still very, very desperately want to move ahead. If we go back, back to before the war started, even in the early 2000s, the neocons were trying to decide, there are three revisionist powers that we have to knock out, essentially Russia, China, and Iran. These are the big, demonic forces that we have to subjugate. And the question was really around sequencing. Do we knock out China first and then clear up afterwards with Russia and Iran? Or do we have Russia as the appetizer and then go to China and then have Iran as kind of a after dish? And it really was this question of sequencing, but there was no question that China was the main dish. Well, what happened was that, Syria came into play. Russia was supporting Syria. And that's when the Nuland faction decided that we have to knock out Russia first, because otherwise they're going to mess up our plans in the Middle East. And so they, pivoted to Russia, provoked this war, and they expected for it to be a cakewalk, right? I mean, the neocons always think this. And then it turned out that, as we know right now, NATO and the United States are thoroughly being trounced on the battlefield. It's not simply, it's not about territory. It's about manpower. It's also about doctrine. It's about essentially strategic capacity, which is being completely depleted in Ukraine. And so the U.S. wants to cut bait and see if it can have this appropriate division of labor, and Russia is not letting that happen. And the EU is insecure and unsure of what to do, and it's just kind of tugging at the pant legs and pulling the United States in deeper. So this is the gambit that didn't work out, and now they're paying the price. And of course, they're still seeking to pivot strongly to China, but that's not going to work out so well with all the other factors that are coming into play at this point. At this point, I sometimes think of that term from Hegel, where he talks about the cunning of reason, that history moves in this kind of set of knights moves. And what Trump is really trying to achieve, he's accomplishing the opposite. He's making the multipolar world more coherent, more in solidarity with each other. And he's starting to see the depletion of his own capacities. There's a belief that, this Ukraine was going to be like Afghanistan, that they were going to continue to bleed out through this continuous small wars. And that's not going to happen, basically because the United States still does not understand small wars and counterinsurgencies. They've been, working on doctrine for 2 decades on small wars, and they simply still don't understand it. The key thing to understand is that guerrilla warfare relies on morale. And when your morale is broken, you really don't have a capable fighting force.
Yeah, I definitely want before we move on, your final thoughts on this, Brian. Anything that KJ said, you can certainly follow up on. But also, it does feel like what's going on is that the United States, you made the argument, it's always trying to extend this conflict. It also feels like it's trying to kick the can down the road, so to speak, as a way to extend this conflict by consistently moving the goalpost of when this so-called quote unquote peace that they are supposedly seeking, the United States, Donald Trump and his administration. We heard 24 hours. We heard a couple weeks, even just recently. We heard very soon after the Putin-Trump meeting in Alaska, there would be a Zelensky-Putin meeting. None of this transpired. And here is now Steve Witkoff saying when he expects a deal to occur.
So we have to address all of those things, but we understand that. We have technical teams working on it, and we're hopeful that by the end of this year, we actually, and maybe quite a bit sooner, we actually can find the ingredients to get to that peace deal.
So end of this year, Brian, end of this year. That is quite a different story from what we have been hearing up until this point. Your thoughts on anything KJ said and this?
Well, again, the Trump administration continues these theatrics, talking about seeking peace, how elusive it is, blaming everybody except themselves for why there is no peace. The entire war, entirely, 100%, is because the United States deliberately created it. As KJ was saying, this was meant to draw in the Russians, tie them up, bleed them out. That's literally in the policy papers. Rand Corporation, Extending Russia, 2019. They had a whole chapter about this. They admitted that Ukraine would be completely destroyed in the process, almost certainly. And that is what we are watching happen. And what they're trying to do is stretch this out for as long as possible. And they did hope that this would overextend and bleed Russia. In some ways, it kind of has. Again, if you look at Syria, the collapse of Syria, that was Russia being forced to make decisions. Do we focus on Ukraine and prioritize that, or do we divert resources to Syria? And they decided they're going to focus and prioritize Ukraine, and Syria collapsed, which shows that there are limits to what Russia and also Iran and also what China can do and not do. But they have decided to focus on Ukraine. As you say, the goalposts constantly change. The U.S. is in a position of weakness regarding Ukraine. They will never admit this. They don't want to admit this. And just as J.D. Vance was trying to do, trying to make it out as if this is all part of the plan. This isn't because Russia has constantly said no, and they're continuing the process on the battlefield and just going through the motions with all of these talks that the U.S. is proposing. Having President Putin meet with President Zelensky, what is the purpose of this meeting? There is no purpose to have this meeting. President Zelensky in Ukraine is in charge of nothing. He makes no decisions. This isn't a war he himself started. This is a war the people who put him into power and keep him in power started. So why, again, and I'm pretty sure it was President Putin at one point. Maybe he's too polite to have said something like this. Maybe I misheard. But when a dog is barking, you don't get on your hands and knees and bark back. You talk to the person holding the leash, which is why Russia insists on talking to the United States and demands that the United States do something about this, not Russia, not Ukraine. It's because it's not Ukraine that Russia is actually fighting. And so it all comes back to these fundamental first principles, what the conflict actually is in reality versus what the United States, and the government, the media, what they're trying to portray this as. The idea of President Trump being some sort of neutral, objective mediator, trying to get Russia and Ukraine together, is just an absolute absurdity. And when you present such absurdities to a nation that you are attacking, you're carrying out a war of aggression by proxy against, you're insulting their intelligence on top of everything else you've been doing to them, threatening their national security right on their border. And so I think Russia would have to be insane to agree to any of this and to deviate from their current course of action, which is to settle this on the battlefield once and for all, even if it does cost them elsewhere along their periphery. Is Danny there? I could
Yeah. Sorry, I'm a bit frozen.
No worries.
KJ, to you.
Yes, I agree absolutely. And as I said, once again, Russia is undeceived. It is going to decide this on the battlefield. And as we know, the United States doesn't have, I think that the EU and NATO no longer have even the moral or the morale to continue fighting. Essentially, they're just stringing this along. What this looks a lot like is the Korean War. And if you remember the Korean War, as the war was drawing down, South Korea was not at the table to negotiate. It was, of course, the proxy military was the attack dog. But eventually, when it came down to brass tacks and the negotiations for the armistice were happening, South Korea was literally not at the table. To this day, there is an armistice, but South Korea is not a party to the armistice. And I think it's a very similar situation. I think the US would like it to be kind of frozen in a Korea-type situation. We also know that immediately after the armistice was signed, the US declared that it wasn't going to uphold most of the key clauses of the armistice. And so we are in a continued frozen war up to the current moment with North Korea. But I think that is an instructive kind of historical example. And certainly in the same fashion, the US, which went in with tremendous proxy force and tremendous hubris, had itself really chewed up and literally humiliated and destroyed on the battlefield. I think we're seeing the same type of phenomenon right now.
Well, let's talk about this weapons question, because I think it's an important one to highlight, given that Brian, you made the point that, and KJ, you made the point that this is all about China, but the United States is very bogged down in Ukraine, and the situation with authorizing long-range weapons has kind of been like whiplash. There has been so many conflicting reports, and I'll just go over some of them now. You had, on the one hand, the Wall Street Journal reporting that Trump says Ukraine has no chance of winning war without striking Russia. So he said this just after he had announced that the Pentagon announced that Ukraine was supposedly blocked from striking deep inside of Russia. But the plot thickens when you have actually the United States under Donald Trump authorizing the transfer of long-range weapons to Ukraine. First of thousands are making their way to Ukraine. These are the extended range attack munitions missiles that are going to be used instead of ATACMS, because ATACMS are off limits, Brian. So talk about this kind of whiplash that the Trump administration is doing. On the one hand, saying, no, there isn't going to be no long-range attacks on Russia, then authorizing all of these weapons to Ukraine, even as it says it is only selling weapons to NATO now. Oh, you're muted.
I do it at least once every time. And this is even as the United States is performing reconnaissance flights to provide targeting information to Ukraine to carry out long-range strikes with Ukrainian missiles. And so it's just more of this theater. If you saw in the headline of the article talking about blocking Ukraine from using U.S. missiles to strike Russia, it said to get Putin into peace talks or whatever they were calling it. And again, that was just to try to lure Russia in, I don't think trick them into a freeze, but to force them in a position where they felt compelled to agree to yet another Minsk-style freeze, and Russia has said no. And so it's a matter of time before the United States reauthorizes strikes on Russia, reauthorizes the use of Western missiles, whatever quantity still exists. And just as you pointed out, there's these ERAM, if maybe that's what they're calling them, missiles that are on their way. They're basically glide bombs, as far as we can tell, glide bombs that have a small jet engine, like a cruise missile, essentially, put on them. They're supposed to be extremely low cost and capable of being manufactured in larger quantities than cruise missiles that actually have a longer range, it would seem, than the version of the ATACMS, Storm Shadow, and Scalp missiles that were sent to Ukraine, which have a shorter range as export versions than the versions that are used by the United States, the UK, and France. So, what are they going to use these converted glide bombs or missiles, if you want to call them? What are they going to use them to do? They're going to strike targets further behind the line of contact. It's not going to change anything. 3,000, I think the official number is 3,350. That is what's being sold to Ukraine. We have no idea how many of these actually exist. It's almost certainly not the entire quantity. They're being manufactured right now. I think I saw somewhere they said the first 1,000 will reach Ukraine over the course of 2 years. 2 years. Just to get 1,000 of these missiles. And Danny, you were talking about the numbers of missiles and drones used in just one single attack by Russia. And so it's just a tremendous mismatch. It has been the case in every respect all throughout this conflict, whether you're talking about artillery, rockets, missiles, drones. Russia just has this vastly larger military industrial base, and they're producing more weapons and ammunition than the US and Europe combined. And these are air-launched missiles. So even if they had all 3,350 missiles right now in Ukraine, they only have a handful of military aircraft capable of launching them. They could only launch a certain number of them at a time. This was the same problem they had with other air launch systems like the Storm Shadow and Scalp. They fly a number of aircraft. It's highly risky because Russian warplanes and air defense systems can actually target the aircraft themselves. And they have significant air and missile defense systems that can take out these missiles. You need to launch a huge amount of these missiles just to saturate Russian air and missile defenses, in the hopes that at least some of these missiles get through. And at one point, what Ukraine was doing was striking at civilian targets because they couldn't strike at anything that was actually defended by Russian air and missile defense systems. So this is, it's a new administration, a new wonder weapon of sorts. It illustrates perfectly the continuity of agenda that exists across U.S. foreign policy. This weapons program actually was announced 2023, 2024, during the Biden administration. And what does President Trump, who said he was going to end the conflict in 24 hours, what does he do? He picks it up right where the Biden administration left off, and he's continuing it. He's seeing it through to the end. These, in whatever quantity they arrive in, they will arrive, and then they will be used. And we're watching right now in real time the Trump administration shaping the narrative to go from blocking the use of long-range missiles on targets in Russia to eventually authorizing it. You see them making the case in real time right now.
Yeah, same question to you, KJ. What's the significance of this?
It's business as usual. This is the continuation of what they were planning. If you recall, I mentioned the third offset. This is the doctrine of war. And essentially, it's dispersion, diffusion, distribution using networked attacks. That you want to saturate, overwhelm with diffuse and spread out attacks, in particular using long-range standoff weapons. But of course, all of this is predicated on the idea that you actually have the industrial capacity to do this. And we know that the US has been deindustrializing for now 50 years. And as it's been deindustrializing, it's also been de-skilling for 50 years. And what it was going to do was it was going to get its other vassals, most notably Japan, Korea, and India, to be the key manufacturers for the industrial supply chain. Well, that is already running into problems because, as we've just seen, India, is being recalcitrant, and they don't consider them to be very trustworthy. And South Korea just had a new government, and Lee Jae-myung is talking about, building ships for the U.S. and et cetera, et cetera. But I think that will not go very far. I really don't believe that Lee Jae-myung wants to get involved in a U.S. war. Certainly, he doesn't want to build the foundation for a war against China or even against Ukraine. And of course, Japan is the old reliable vassal. But that's simply because the U.S. is the successor colonizer state to Japan. Essentially, the Japanese colonies were taken over by the United States, Taiwan, South Korea, the Marianas, the Marshall Islands, Guam, the entire Pacific island chain, the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa. So they've essentially become the successor colonizer to the Japanese empire, and they occupy the colonies that Japan has possessed. But still, I don't think it's going to be enough. I don't think there's enough, dispersed long-range standoff weaponry. I don't think they have worked out the automation properly. I think they are going to rely on subsurface warfare, which is a key part of the third offset. I think there's going to be a lot of deceit or deceitful attacks involved. And yes, there will be strikes deep inland into Russia, which will, as we've seen in the past, will be focused on strategic targets, which is an incredibly risky strategy. But it's what air-land battle, air-sea battle, all these doctrines work from. They're premised on that notion of decapitation. And the thing that I'm most worried about, because the US does not have the conventional capacity, is that it is going to use tactical nukes as a way of pressing the issue and creating an advantage. And as I've said before, if you look at the papers circulating in Washington right now, everybody's talking about using tactical nukes in a kind of seamless continuum with conventional warfare.
Yeah. And Brian, given the gravity of what KJ just mentioned, not a lot of people are talking about this incredible rebranding that the Trump administration is doing right now with arming Ukraine. Now, what the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself, the entire administration, what they are saying, their line is that they are now selling weapons to NATO, and NATO is doing whatever they want with them. But no longer is the United States arming Ukraine directly or funding it directly. Here is the word straight from the horse's mouth.
I want to talk about we're no longer involved with funding Ukraine, but we are involved with trying to stop the war and the killing in Ukraine. So we're selling missiles and military equipment, millions and millions, and ultimately billions of dollars to the NATO people, where I'm very friendly and we have a great relationship. But that was an amazing trip. So they're funding the entire war. We're not funding anything. I think it's an important point to make because a lot of people don't understand that.
A lot of people don't understand it, Brian. The United States is no longer funding the war, but sending millions upon millions, billions worth of weapons to NATO. Your assessment of this, your reaction?
Yes, well, of course, NATO was created by and for the United States. It is simply an extension of U.S. foreign policy. It controls everything NATO does. It's the primary financier of NATO and everything that it does. And so what this is a political and financial shell game that the Trump administration is playing. It's meant to dupe the Trump administration's own supporters, the people who voted for President Trump. And it's a way of saying, I know you voted me in to stop all of these wars of aggression abroad that we all blamed President Biden for. And we're going to continue all of these wars. But at least American tax dollars aren't being spent on the war, which isn't true. Of course, they're still going to spend money on these wars. Everything that the US is doing to support this, even if it's not directly funding the weapons, which they might actually be doing also. But even if they're not funding the weapons, if they're forcing Europe to buy that, there's so many other things the United States continues to do to support this war, including maintaining U.S. generals at the top of Ukraine's armed forces chain of command. The CIA continues to operate all across Ukraine. I continuously am mentioning these reconnaissance flights. That all costs money. That all costs money for the U.S. to continue this proxy war against Russia, even if it pretends that it's not paying for the weapons anymore. All that money being made off of these weapons is not going to the American people. It's going to a very small handful of corporate financier interests, the arms industry in particular. This money does not filter down to the ordinary American. And so all the problems that people voted President Trump into office to solve continue to be, not just continue, but are being compounded by this policy. Now, you're saying we're not sending the weapons, we're selling them. It's the exact same thing. It is exactly the same thing. And we're watching Europe right now commit collective suicide alongside Ukraine, which is committing national suicide. And we're watching their economies unravel for a multitude of reasons, but all tied to the pursuit of U.S. hegemony at the expense of Europe for Washington and Wall Street. I was just listening to the Duran. They were talking about a possible IMF bailout for the UK, possibly even France. And who runs the IMF? Who created it? Who runs it? And who is going to be primarily involved in all of that? The United States is. And when the United States is bailing out the UK because they're buying US weapons that they can't afford, then it's actually the US still paying for them in a roundabout way. So that's why I say it's a financial and political shell game meant to dupe the American public. The war continues uninterrupted. As that actually it's accelerating. It's escalating. And they're going to continue along this line. They're just going to say whatever they need to say to placate the American people. Americans were upset with this war, but now they put a Republican in, and he's going to convince all the Republicans to go along with it. And we've watched this take place. We remember Bush Jr. saying he's going to end all the adventurism abroad, and he started 2 major wars, and he got all the Republicans on board. And then we heard Obama say he's going to end all of Bush's wars. And then he kept all of them going and started new wars. He got all the Democrats who were all anti-war on board with global war absolutely everywhere. And then Trump, and then Biden, and now Trump again. So it's a very familiar scam, I would say, duping the American people, playing on this left-right political paradigm that does not represent any real divide in America. It's just a means of marketing and selling empire to different target markets.
Yeah, and it's important to know that, as you have noted in the past, Brian, I know you've said this, KJ, that they don't actually say they're going to end these wars. It's always a very careful kind of process of using language. For example, Obama with his Bush's dumb wars are going to be pulled back. And of course, you had Bush the same way, saying, well, we're going to scale back militarily. Trump has said this now in 2 different administrations that there would be peace with détente with Russia, that there would be an end to the Ukraine conflict now, and things keep going. And so, KJ, with this feels like an intentional and deliberate kind of rebranding exercise, because if Donald Trump has said this many times, Europe is over there. So actually it's their war now. This is what Pete Hegseth was saying in February. Actually, it's their war. So we want them to have responsibility for it, despite it being actually the US's war primarily. But nonetheless, what is the difference? What is your take on what's the difference if the US is selling whatever weapons it has left to NATO, or maybe we should say more properly European countries, just hand them to Ukraine? I don't see a difference, but do you?
There isn't a difference, because people think that weapons are hardware, but it's not. The modern battlefield is a networked joint operations system that is just completely interconnected. And so in order for a weapons quote unquote kill chain to work, you have the sensors, you have the radar, you have the decision centers, you have all the tactical data networks connecting all of that. And all of that comes as an entire package. So to say, oh, we're just, we're selling them as opposed to giving them, that's a distinction without a difference. It's the entire system which is being deployed and used, and that is still under US control. Now, as much as possible, yes, it is true they want to offload the cost to Europe because the US economy is not doing well, and certainly the European economy is not doing well. The Germans have just said, we can no longer afford a welfare state, although they seem to be very certain that they can afford, a 5% military budget. So Europe is being bled dry, and it's being used as cannon fodder against Russia. And the US is sitting back, and they're quite happy to deplete Europe in this fashion, as they did in the previous world wars, where Europe did most of the fighting and the US led from behind and then picked up, and then lo and behold, it became the global superpower. So there is that calculation going on as well. And also the idea that essentially we're hitting a real wall, not simply strategically, but geoeconomically. The capitalist system is essentially in full breakdown. And as I've said before, when you have the system going into cardiac arrest, the wall defibrillator that you use to reanimate the corpse of the capitalist system is war. So we're going into full world war, and the US is happy to profit off of that process, even as it tries to get as much of its work subcontracted and offloaded and offshored, to its vassals. And of course, the vassals are falling for that.
Yeah, Brian, maybe you can elaborate on this point before we move on, because you've been talking a lot about Europe being, totally aligned with what the US is doing, and that there has been a deliberate attempt to pin this onto Europe, and Europe embracing it. And I saw some commenting on this saying it's quite interesting that as the US's hegemony reaches this kind of crisis point, and it becomes more difficult to sway and influence its spheres of power. It's unable to really move Russia and China in particular, as it so wants to, out of their rising positions. Yet Europe is more and more aligned and attached to the United States. What do you think this is? Why do you think Europe, because a lot of people are wondering this, why do you think Europe is so attached to its master, as Mark Rutte of NATO, the NATO General Secretary, said, it's daddy, so to speak, even using language like this?
Well, I just want to say KJ made an excellent point about the kill chain and how all of that remains under the domain of the United States. And essentially, they pay for all of that also. And so, yes, they're sending this hardware, offloading the cost onto the Europeans. As I explained, eventually the U.S. is going to have to pick up that tab, because you cannot get this money from nowhere. It has to come from somewhere, and this is not sustainable. And so the United States is still paying for the war, just indirectly, in a way ordinary American voters aren't going to grasp. And they know that, and they're taking advantage of that. So I think it's very important to drive that point home. Now, this brings us to the next question about why is Europe doing this? Why are they making decisions that obviously don't benefit Europe collectively or any of the member states of the European Union individually? Why are they doing this? And I see a lot of analysts make this mistake where they look at the best interests of any particular country, and they automatically assume that the leadership in that country is going to pursue those interests. They say, this war makes no sense. The Europeans are obviously not going to go along with that. But that is a mistake, because the United States, as I repeatedly say, their super weapon is their ability to politically interfere, influence, and capture a targeted nation or a targeted region of the planet. The European Union was created in the first place by the US, by special interests in the US, to politically capture all of Europe. That is what they have done. And that's why you see these leaders of Europe making decisions that serve US interests at the absolute expense of Europe, even to the extent where you're watching Europe move towards economic collapse, socioeconomic collapse. The political system is unsustainable. And you see them playing these games with left-right politics all across Europe. You have the people in power now, whatever party they're affiliated with in whatever country you want to talk about. And then they have opposition talking tough about how they're going to fix everything, they're going to change everything. And as soon as the people vote them into power, it acts as it releases this political pressure and anger and frustration the voters have. But of course, these people come in and they do the exact same thing. It is the same process as in the US between Democrat and Republican. They are all owned and directed by unelected corporate financier special interests. There is one single agenda, and they're carrying it out, and they're just using different slogans, branding, and broken promises to continue kicking the can down the road. That is what they're doing in Europe. And as long as any particular country is politically captured by the US, instead of assuming they will pursue their own best interests, assume that they will serve US interests at their own expense, no matter how costly that is. And so you have to look at a country, not just at what its fundamental best interests actually are, but whether or not the government in power is politically captured. And if it is, then don't hold out hope that they're going to serve their own best interests and eventually break with the US. And one last thing I want to say is, before 2014, it was obvious that Europe's best interests were with Russia and China. And you saw the relationship vastly expanding to the point where even I was convinced that they would work their way out from under the shadow of US hegemony cast over them since the end of World War II. But they didn't. Again, because they were politically captured. And whatever political holdouts of European independence that existed, the US extinguished. And with the conflict that they themselves created in Ukraine from 2014 onward, they used that to push Europe in this direction. And there's so much momentum now that it's not going to stop or change direction. It will continue in this direction.
Yeah. And KJ, your final thoughts on this, because, I remember when Emmanuel Macron visited China, I believe this was a few years back under the Biden administration. After he visited, he was singing a tune that almost sounded like he was aligned with China on so many issues, Taiwan, etc. The one tune that does not change is China's warning to Europe. China has warned Europe strategic autonomy is really your only hope in terms of maintaining any kind of semblance of sovereignty. And now you have a situation where Europe is not only gleefully taking up the mantle as the primary attack dog on the leash of the United States regarding Ukraine against Russia, but then you also have European countries lining up to sanction China, lining up now to sanction Iran. It seems like they're very committed to following the US's agenda. But what's your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think they're connected. They're committed to war. They're committed to hegemony, to US unipolar dominance. And they're, yanking all their Atlanticist ties. Those Atlanticist ties are enduring, and they're foundational to the structure of the ruling imperial elite in Europe and the United States. So they're all singing from the same choir book, working in harmony. Although from time to time, it looks like they're dissenting or trying something different. It's not. It's like the ventriloquist dummy that talks back to the ventriloquist. It looks like like the ventriloquist dummy is arguing, but no, the dummy is still being controlled by the ventriloquist. And so the way that I see it, and once again, this is big picture stuff, but in 2008, the French president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, said, "Laissez-faire, c'est fini." He said, "Capitalism is finished." because that's essentially what happened. The global financial system collapsed around the ears of the ruling imperial elite. And that's when they realized that they needed to take extreme measures. What are those extreme measures? Well, the extreme measure is, as you have monopoly capital, it runs into a crisis, a falling rate of profit, if you will. And then in order to resuscitate itself, it needs to shift and expand. And usually that expansion requires some kind of massive new influx of resources. Ideally, you want to be able to plunder a new continent in order to keep the dead vampire, to feed the dead vampire with new blood. So that is what they are counting on. And the key resource field that they consider to be unmined, I mean, there are smaller areas like, for example, Myanmar, which they wanted to bring online because, it's so rich with resources. But really, the real resource that they want to plunder and extract from is China. China was originally supposed to fall of its own internal contradictions, and then the US would swoop in like it did with the Soviet Union, privatize everything, and there would be this new influx of capital and resources that would resuscitate, the dying vampire. And what happened instead in 2008 was that actually the West collapsed around its own ears, and it was China that was actually strong. And the US had to go to China hat in hand and ask for a bailout. And of course, once you've done something like that, the US can never forgive China for helping it when it was down. No good deed goes unpunished. And so that's when the daggers came out. That's when the doctrine of war against China was specifically crafted, called air-sea battle, which is simply adaptation of the Soviet era battle doctrine against the USSR, air-land battle, which is actually an adaptation of Israeli war doctrine from the Yom Kippur War, which is essentially aggressive, deep decapitation strikes. So the Europeans could go two ways. They could go for win-win cooperation with China and the global South and the rising BRICS. They had that choice. Or they can see things in terms of hegemony and unipolar domination, and then they see the world in these win-lose terms, and then it's about waging war and seeing if they can rapaciously destroy China and other countries, and then reinvigorate the capitalist system with fresh blood. And what they've done is they've chosen the latter, primarily because it's part of their indoctrination. They've all been selected to those high positions. They've been groomed for those high positions for decades. That's why they're in those positions to begin with. And then the second thing is really this kind of racist, supremacist notion that, we don't want equals. We'd rather destroy the world than have a world of equals, especially where we are equals with the global South, the people of color, the Chinese, the Asians, etc. We cannot tolerate that. We would rather see the end of the world than the end of our white Western supremacy and privilege and power. And this thinking goes back so deep and so long. It's the reason why, for example, when George Kennan was asked about the long telegram, somebody asked him, we've coexisted with all these other countries, the French and the British have coexisted. Why can't we coexist with Russia? And he hemmed and hawed and gave sociology, psychology, history, etc., etc. And at the end of and then he just kind of boiled it down because he got tired of talking. He said, the fact is the Russians are an Asiatic race, and we cannot have equal relations with them.
Well, speaking of gentlemen, countries that are not captured politically, that are not collapsing as we speak, Ahead of the major parade that is going to take place, or that will have taken place, depending on when you watch this, in China in September. Ahead of this, we have major developments between Russia and China that are quietly occurring militarily, as there are major shifts, I think, in global dynamics as the Trump administration's foreign policy backfires dramatically. Here you have a first ever joint patrol from Russian and Chinese submarines conducted. And in this patrol, you had, for the first time, Russian and Chinese submarines being sent out together, which is seen as a major development as, in their military-to-military cooperation. Brian, how about you react while this plays? I won't play the sound on this video because it's music, and that will get this video copywritten. So, Brian, your reaction to this development?
Well, it's a reflection and a reaction to what the United States is doing. The United States has this huge army proxies. It is constantly trying to integrate all of these military assets under U.S. command to fight either Russia or China, or Russia and China. And so Russia and China are reacting by making similar preparations. People take for granted interoperability. You cannot just, in the middle of a war, just start fighting together. It takes huge amounts of preparation, training, aligning your systems. As KJ pointed out, it's not just hardware. There's a whole system behind all of this that makes it actually operate and makes it effective. And so seeing these are the type of preparations that need to be made. And of course, as KJ was saying, the US is preparing for war with China. What is that war going to look like? And I think we're getting to see a little bit of that with the US proxy war against Russia. This situation in the Baltic Sea, where the United States, obviously the US primarily, but through NATO, is seeking for ways to complicate Russian shipping. And this is a beta test for what they plan on doing to China globally. They want to stop Chinese maritime shipping worldwide. And this is an advantage the United States still has, in addition to political interference and political capture. They still have this global spanning military that neither Russia nor China have. And if they decide they're going to go to war with China, they'll start some sort of conflict with China in theater, but then they will use their military assets far beyond the theater, beyond the reach of China, and they will use that to try to complicate things like maritime shipping to target the Chinese economy. So it's not as if the United States is going to fight head-to-head with China and try to win or storm the beaches of China. They're not going to do something like that. They're going to surround it, contain it, cut its economy off from the rest of the world by force. They're trying to do it right now through other means, but eventually they will resort to force because they're running out of time. And so this is what Russia and China need to start preparing for. And we saw the United States and European nations testing out these maritime drones targeting Russian shipping in the Black Sea specifically. And now we've seen Russia carry out its own attack on, Ukraine hardly has any vessels at all, but they did have a vessel patrolling in a river, and a Russian surface maritime drone targeted it and attacked it, and at least severely damaged it and caused casualties among the crew. So these are all games that the United States is playing with Russia, that Russia is now playing back with the United States. And of course, between Russia and China, their combined military industrial production, whatever systems the US is going to deploy to implement its strategy against China, China is going to be able to do the same and then some, just as we've seen Russia do throughout this conflict in Ukraine. So we have to see the big picture. All of these conflicts are interconnected because, as KJ says, there's one underlying mentality here: supremacy. They want supremacy. They want it over the entire planet. Everything that they do is a step in this direction. The U.S. sending warships to Venezuela, this is not some sort of separate conflict that the U.S. is starting. Venezuela is an ally to Russia, also friendly with China. And if they can't make progress in Ukraine, they will make progress elsewhere. They're doing the exact same thing they did in Syria. Wherever Russia and China cannot be, that is where the US will hit. And they're trying to knock all of these friends, partners, potential partners off the map to continue to encroach on, encircle, and contain the emerging multipolar world. And the primary pillars of that is Russia and China, and also Iran.
Right. Yeah. KJ.
I agree. And also you can see the targeting of not just naval choke points, but also logistical pathways. Anywhere which is a major thoroughfare for China's interaction with the rest of the world, you're going to see conflict there. This is the conflict in Myanmar, Pakistan, Bangladesh. All of these things are key nodes in the Belt and Road. So you can see this escalation happening, and also the destabilization of governments is also deeply connected. They want to create an arc of instability and harassment and hostility all around China, both from a naval standpoint and from a land standpoint. The key thing to understand about the submarine exercises is that, the colonial powers have always been naval powers. That's how they became naval powers. That's how they became, global empires, is because they were naval powers. There's a military theoretician called Alfred Thayer Mahan. He said that sea power dominates land. If you can dominate the sea, if you can dominate the naval passages and the choke points, you are going to dominate the planet. And this is still true very much to this day, despite other theories that have arisen. What China is doing with Russia in terms of their joint exercises is they're starting to show that the US does not have dominance, complete and total full spectrum dominance over the seas. So some of these exercises are actually pretty challenging to the United States. They call them, maritime interaction. The Chinese call them joint sea. But last year, in July 2024, they went from Jeju Island to the Osumi Strait, into the Western Pacific, and then into the Philippines and the South China Sea. In October, they did another exercises. They went from Sakhalin up in the north through the Pacific to the Philippines, and then to Okinawa, and then around the Miyako Straits and the East China Sea. So these are all key naval choke points and strategic areas. And they're showing that, we can go where we want to. We can exercise our naval power where we want to. Britannia does not rule the waves anymore. And these are very, very strong messages. And now they've added submarines to it, which is, once again, submarines are just another dimension. It's literally another dimension of coordination and integration and tactical data networks. If you're surface vessels, there's still visual coordination possible. But if you're submarines, everything is tactical data networks. And it's also showing the Chinese and the Russians are demonstrating exactly what the third offset is, where the US is supposed to dominate. They're saying that we can encroach in that territory as well. Remember, the third offset is, dispersion, diffusion, long-range standoff, and then subsurface warfare. They're showing that we have strength in subsurface warfare, and you no longer rule the waves or below the waves. And that's a very, very strong message. I think it's particularly poignant in that they started the 2024 joint sea patrols near Jeju Island. Jeju Island is where the Nanjing massacre started. Most people don't realize this, but Jeju Island, small island off the southern tip of Korea, and for now 15 years, Korean activists have been fighting against the construction of a U.S. military base there. But they know, if you look at the history, when the Nanjing massacre started, the bombing started from Jeju Island. And then after the city was depleted, That's when the Japanese went in. The Chinese know their history, they know their geostrategy, and they're sending a very strong message. We will not be bullied in our own front yard, in our own, literal waters. And they're showing that in the strongest way possible with, the Russians, who have tremendous surface and subsurface capacities.
Yeah, and Brian, I don't know if you have heard, but it's it's not even just submarines. It according to the Western media commentariat, panicking about China's celebration of the 80th anniversary of its victory during World War II and the anti-fascist war, as they call it, in China. They also said that China is going to unveil hypersonic missiles, advanced weaponry, and it's doing so with a crowd that they're calling the axis of upheaval. But what it really looks like is the axis of the U.S.'s targets of war and sanctions: Iran, DPRK, North Korea, Belarus, Zimbabwe, Cuba, and so many more attending that are direct targets of regime change and war from the United States. But the United States is calling it the axis of upheaval. So your thoughts and assessment of what KJ was saying in particular about this, build up almost toward like a parity with the United States as a form of deterrence. Is it working? And of course, how does this impact how the U.S. approaches Russia and China in particular, as Russia and China react to these moves?
Well, going back to a point KJ made earlier, the axis of upheaval also looks a lot like nations that aren't majority white people. That's what it looks like to me. And this hits at the core of the issue. The U.S. And Europe, and having inherited the European empires and taken them over and expanded them, that's what this is all about. It's about white Western supremacy, and they all but say it. And this is what is driving them. This and this prioritizing of profit and power over everything else, which is unsustainable, and of course does not serve the best interests of the vast majority of the people, both living under these types of people, but also subjected to the machinations of these type of people. Again, the whole rest of the world. And now, yes, just China alone, the United States acknowledges, is reaching parity on almost every conceivable level. Ship production, China vastly produces more ships than the United States. The U.S. acknowledges that there's no possible way for them to ever catch up. They're talking about changing U.S. law so that other countries that actually still do shipbuilding, maybe they could help build naval vessels for the United States, nations like South Korea. And then, of course, submarines, as KJ said, this is one of the strengths that the U.S. still has that they want to try to maintain. But again, China is catching up in this realm as well. And then when you take China and add it together with just Russia, you're talking about expanding this power, this parity even further. And so this is what the Chinese and Russians are doing together with other partners. This is why the U.S. is reacting the way it is. This is why they are rushing their policy at this point. They realize time is not on their side. As things are now, if it continues in this direction, there will be a point of no return where the multipolar world rises, and it is irreversible. The U.S. can do nothing about it. And then all of these problems that the U.S. has right now, they will just continue to compound exponentially as all of the monopolies that they have built their power up with disintegrate and blow away. So they're racing against time to try to achieve this. You can even see where Russian and Chinese military capabilities have expanded, forcing the U.S. to push back its schedule in terms of what it sought to do to both Russia and China. Areas where they have failed, but there are also areas where they have succeeded. And again, I constantly warn about this. Yes, China's military is growing in strength. It is reaching parity with the United States. In many ways, it has surpassed the United States, but the US is still highly active all along China's periphery, politically interfering, influencing, short-circuiting the best interests of all of these nations in the Asia-Pacific region. I'm based here in Southeast Asia. Most of the nations in Southeast Asia, to a great extent, is either partially captured or in some way influenced by the US to sidestep their own best interests to serve Washington. The current government in Thailand, for example, is run by a billionaire who's not actually technically in power. He serves US interests at the cost of Thailand. Cambodia now has a government that had been working closely with China, but has now pivoted hard back toward the United States. And a lot of people weren't really watching that carefully, and I think they still misunderstand the dynamics there. And of course, the Philippines has been not just captured, but the U.S. is now consolidating control over the Philippines and is rapidly building it up to be a Southeast Asian version of Ukraine. And so these are things that China, Russia, the multipolar world, I think, need to do more about. They're great at building up military power, offering superior economic deals to these other nations. But if the U.S. can reach into these nations, remove leadership that reflects their best interests, and replace them with a client regime that serves U.S. interests at their expense, transforming these countries into battering rams, or just making them dysfunctional enough where they don't serve as a constructive partner for China, then this short circuits China's strengths that it has and is trying to grow out. So they need to do more about not just, I mean, they do a good job protecting their own political independence. Russia and China do a great job protecting their information space, but they're not doing a very good job helping partners and potential partners do likewise. And if this cannot be solved, the battle for human minds, essentially, and the US's ability, their superiority in terms of brainwashing people, capturing them, indoctrinating them, I mean, that is all human civilization is a collection of human minds. And if the U.S. dominates the mind, they have the ability to dominate everything else, no matter how lopsided the advantage is in favor of multipolarism.
Well, KJ, your reaction to that in particular, as we see, for example, one of the major, I think we're seeing the United States having difficulties as there is this kind of conflict between the unipolar, multipolar world. Difficulty is really managing how it goes about addressing each and every one of the flashpoints it wants to see toppled. But you even have a situation like here where you have Taiwan, part of China, but a major cog, maybe the primary flashpoint for the United States to eventually get to a kind of kinetic conflict with China. But yet here we see Taiwan, its people, maybe you say Chinese people, don't think a war is coming soon. And they just had a poll actually here from the so-called National Defense and Strategic Research Institute based on the island, where 65% said that they don't believe in the next 5 years there's going to be any kind of conflict whatsoever. So what do you make of this in light of these challenges? Because on the one hand, you have a declining empire, and on the other hand, you have an empire that is hell-bent on war and doing everything it can to create the chaos and instability necessary to wage it. How do you assess, especially in particular China, but really the entirety of the multipolar world's response to all of this?
Well, the declining empire is the most dangerous empire. It's that, dying animal, which is the most deadly and the most vicious. And as I've said, I've, analogized it to the drunk at the bar who struck out, whose credit cards have been rejected, and the bar is closing, and the drunk will not go home. In this case, the US is the drunk, and it is drunk with power, and it won't go home without a fight. In fact, it's spoiling for a fight. It'll fight everybody and everyone. So in that context, we're in an extraordinarily dangerous position. And Taiwan is an interesting situation. As I said, the US empire in East Asia is essentially the recreation of the Japanese empire. It's the successor empire. Just as you have successor states, you have successor empires or successor colonizers. US is the successor colonizer to Japan, just as it was the successor colonizer to the French in Vietnam. And so you can see that the key US colonies are actually former Japanese colonies. I'm talking about the Philippines and Taiwan. Taiwan was a Japanese colony. It was used as, a forward base to attack China. And of course, South Korea. These were all colonies, as well as, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, all of these, Wake Island. These are all, stepping stones to Pacific dominance, just as they were for the Japanese. Inside this context, Taiwan is the spear point of the aggression and the provocation. It has been Ukrainized for the past 10 years since the pivot to Asia. And in that sense, it's because it's the center of the first island chain. It is one of the closest places to China if you wanted to attack it. It guards the two strategic gateways that lead out into the Pacific Ocean, namely the Miyako Straits and on the left with the Philippines. So there are two strategic gateways that allow China access into the deep waters of the Pacific in order to exercise its strategic deterrent with submarines. Otherwise, they're trapped in the shallow continental shelf where they can be easily detected and taken out. So in that sense, Taiwan is so critical to U.S. strategy that, for at least, 3 years now, the U.S. has passed this thing called the Taiwan Enhanced Resiliency Act, TERA. And that is essentially a plan to not only micromanage and micro-audit Taiwan's military, but also to micromanage and micro-audit Taiwan's government itself. And they put in this vassal, William Lai, who was, just another successor to the previous DPP vassal. His vice president is actually an American citizen, a former American citizen. This is Louise Hsiao. She was the darling of the neocon circuit in Washington. And she is actually a Jersey girl. She's from New Jersey. She's a preacher's daughter from New Jersey. And she is the person who is supposed to be the minder for William Lai, to make sure that Taiwan is fed into the wood chipper and used as a new Ukraine. But of course, the people of Taiwan have a completely different idea because they are literally family with the people in Fujian province. The vast majority of people in Taiwan Island have relatives in China. They're literally, a family. They don't want to go to war with family, and they certainly don't want to go to war because their captured U.S. ruling elite want to create a provocation against China. And so we recently saw a very interesting phenomena. The DPP, the ruling quisling U.S. allied party, was having difficulties because the legislature was captured by the opposition party. And so instead of negotiating and managing their differences in a normal fashion as any reasonable government would do, they decided to pull a legislative coup. And they were going to recall every single one of the opposition party candidates from the legislative yuan, from the legislative body, so that they would, then reset, start from new and then place their party members into the legislative yuan. And this is a very extraordinarily deceitful thing to do. It undermines any notion of democracy because it's much easier to recall a candidate than it is to actually get voted in. All you need is 25% of the electorate. And most of the time when you're voted in, you're 50 or 50 plus. And so they were using this little hack in order to pull a legislative coup. And what was interesting was that the Taiwanese population, they overwhelmingly rejected this attempt at recalling the opposition party members. In fact, they were opposed by even stronger numbers than when they were first elected. So this legislative coup has completely failed. And so the Taiwan Quisling class is actually in a little bit of a jam right now because the opposition party does not want war. The Quislings want war. They want to be used as a battering ram against China, and they'll do it by, doing some kind of provocation that involves, quote unquote, independence. But the opposition party does not want that. The vast majority of people on Taiwan Island do not want that. And so the US is seeing difficulty there. And it's also seeing a little bit of difficulty in Korea too, because as you know, Yoon Suk-yeol was the ultimate Quisling. He was singing Miss American Pie to Biden, and he was, essentially the US's man in Seoul. He was going to do everything the US wanted him to do. And he tried to pull a military coup. He was going to turn the country into a military dictatorship and along the way provoke a war with North Korea, which would then have transferred operational control of South Korea's 3.6 million troops to the US to use as cannon fodder in preparation for war against China. Yoon Suk-yeol failed in his military coup, and the military dictatorship didn't get to pass. He's currently in jail. His wife is also being arrested. And the entire plan, the plan that this was clearly a Biden administration thing, that plan has been completely thwarted. And so now they have to deal with Lee Jae-myung, who wants to balance with China against the United States. He wants to have win-win relations with both countries. They recently pulled him into Washington, and I think they were going to do the Zelensky treatment on him. That is, put him in his place, tell him what to do. And just before the meeting, Donald Trump said, South Korea's government, has undergone a coup. It's illegitimate. And he blasted that tweet just before they met. But what was interesting was Lee Jae-myung met with him, and then he was able to charm him and, kind of disarm him so that Donald Trump didn't get anything he wanted. They certainly didn't get to bully him or force him into, concessions that he didn't want to do. And then to top it off, Lee Jae-myung brought Donald Trump this big gold ship called the Turtle Ship, which is a kind of a coded message because this is the ship that the Koreans used to smash the Japanese in 1598, when the Japanese were invading. So there's some very kind of coded messages, but Donald Trump took it because it's big and fancy and full of gold. And then he also took Lee Jae-myung's pen. Lee Jae-myung was signing a pen using a fancy fountain pen, and Donald Trump admired it. And so Lee Jae-myung gave it to him. And, I don't mean to get Freudian, but, pen is, related in, the Freudian mythology to phallus and power. And so Donald Trump, actually received, Donald Trump was, getting a pen from Lee Jae-myung, which I think shows a very kind of, let's say, Freudian relationship that was established. But he got nothing of substance. He got symbols, but he did not get anything of substance. And I think that is a good signal. We'll have to wait and see how it all plays out. But the CPAC, neocon, Warhawk class have been temporarily soothed in that they were not able to bully Lee Jae-myung out of, force him to make any concessions.
Yeah. And Brian, your final thought, if you will. We do have one super chat question. So anything you want to add on this before we get to that?
Well, I think it's important to build on what KJ was saying about the island province of Taiwan and the U.S. installed client regime there. These are people who identify as Westerners or even as Americans, even though the people in the United States using them do not see them as equals. They do not have a seat at the table for them when they walk out of the room. They will say things about them, very unflattering things about them. I have been in the room when, say, when I was in the Marines in Japan, and a Japanese officer would leave the room, and all of the white American officers and NCOs mocking him and really getting off on the fact that the U.S. is in someone else's country doing whatever they want, and they have people in their own country coming to them and reporting to them. I mean, this is all part of the psychology of empire all throughout human history, and it applies very much to today. And so if there's one point I want to get across, it's that when the U.S. politically captures a nation, you need to understand that on a fundamental level, that client regime, no matter how irrational the decision might seem in terms of the best interest of that state, they are going to serve U.S. interests, even if it's at the complete expense of that country. People like Zelensky, people that populate the client regime on the island province of Taiwan, the client regimes the U.S. installs periodically into power across Southeast Asia, they don't care if their country gets destroyed because they identify as Westerners. Their place is in the West, and if anything bad happens, they'll take all of their ill-gotten wealth and they'll leave, and they'll go someplace comfortable. The billionaire in Thailand, ousted by a military coup in 2006, spent years in Dubai in absolute luxury. They couldn't care less what happens to their home country. I really want to get that point across. And so we have to understand that. And we have to understand that it's not just about military industrial production, looking at just zeroing in and looking at that in Ukraine or between China and the US, the numbers on paper. We have to look at the big picture and all of the strengths and weaknesses on both sides to assess where this conflict between US-led unipolarism and the rise of multipolarism, where the strengths and weaknesses actually lie.
Yeah, and let's get to this super chat question here. And I want to thank everyone who's given a super chat first. So thank you so much for all of your contributions here to support the show. I appreciate all of you. Thanks for your comments. There's only one question though here, so let's get to it. It's a two-part question. What's the rationale to have policy papers like the 2019 RAND Corporation paper extending Russia public? Is there any proof and evidence of Zelensky profiting from the war? So, Brian, how about you first quickly take up this, because you talk a lot about these policy papers, and KJ, and then I'll introduce something that I would like to get in there. But Brian, you first.
People have to understand that global empire is a massive undertaking. I mean, it seems obvious, but when you really think about it, it's a massive undertaking. It's not something that you can keep secret. The special interests that run the United States, collective Western foreign policy and domestic policy. These are giant corporations and financial institutions, equity firms, the board members, the shareholders. There's thousands of them. And they have to convince tens of thousands of people among the elite to get on the same page. They need to build consensus. That's what the think tanks do. And it would be impossible to keep all of this secret. They don't even try. And do they even need to? Look, that RAND Corporation paper has been public since it was published. I've been screaming from a mountaintop about it literally for years since it was published. And there are still people out there who have not read it, people who don't get it, who've never even heard of it. And the collective West, the special interests driving Western foreign policy, they know this. They know the average person is going to read a headline and jump to conclusions without even reading the body of the article. That's why almost all of my research, I'm citing the Western media. I'm not citing Russian or Chinese media. I'm citing the West's own media. And they put the truth inside the article. If you just read the whole thing, and you do research and you look at it objectively, you can see the truth. They are admitting what the truth is. All of this about the U.S. losing its proxy war in Ukraine, this has all been reported on by the collective Western media since 2022, since it began. Under the headline about how Russia is losing, they will explain what is going on. And if you look at it objectively, you can draw the obvious logical conclusions. They know the vast majority in the public will never do this. They will never read the policy papers. They will hear people talking about the policy papers and dismiss them. A lot of these people engage in partisan politics. They're Democrats or Republicans. They're liberal or they're conservative, and they circle the wagon around their leader, even if they have completely contradicted all of their promises they made during campaign season, which we're watching the Trump supporters do that right now. President Trump has lined his administration wall to wall with neocons. He's continued every single policy the Biden administration implemented, and then some, and expanding upon it. And people are circling their wagons around him because at least he's not a liberal. And we've got a clever answer and rationale why he's betrayed all his campaign promises. And that's just how human nature works. So they don't need to, short answer is they don't need to keep it secret because nobody's going to read them anyway.
I agree with Brian, and I also have a slightly different take on it. There's a way, and if you read a lot of these papers, you'll see that there's a way in which first they kind of discuss and communicate amongst themselves, and then you'll see a process where things get winnowed down, and then they get turned into grand strategy and then doctrine, and then you'll see it go through appropriations and the various committees, and then at a certain point it will vanish and it will move into a classified version. So very often what we're seeing is we're seeing kind of early versions of it, and the later versions are classified. Or if we do see a declassified version, it's very cloaked and it's very innocuous. It's kind of toned down a little bit, but you kind of have to sense what the original DNA and the intention was. So it is a kind of an interpretive task. And as I've said before over and over, when you read these things, you have to interpret the vocabulary in a very specific way. For example, air-sea battle is referred to as an operational concept. Now that sounds innocuous, operational concept, but operations mean war, and operational concept means plans for war. And so if you start to unpack that, then you understand this stuff is really, really aggressive and deadly. And so, in other words, defense means offense, security means hegemony, deter means to provoke or to aggress. You have to start creating a lexicon where you start to decode that, and then it starts to make sense. And then the other dimension of these papers, especially the early papers, which are put out into the public, they may not be read by the general audience, but they're being carefully read by opponents. And they're a kind of signaling or messaging to the other country. They're essentially saying, we are going to fuck you up. This is what's coming for you. And it's this kind of like macho posturing before the war happens, is to intimidate and threaten ahead of time. If you look at, for example, a 2015 RAND paper, essentially it's saying that China don't even think about going to war with us because we have all the advantages. This constant messaging and signaling that is also built into it. And I think it ties down to what Brian had said much earlier, but which I think is the most important takeaway from this discussion is the greatest power of the West is, it's not its warfare or its industrial capacity or its technological prowess. It's its capacity to mind fuck, to screw with people's minds. There are 6 domains of war, air, land, sea, and space, that is cyberspace, outer space, and mental space. And mental space is the one that they have completely colonized and dominated. People internalize that oppression. They work against their own interests. They work against their own people, against humanity, against logic and reason. And it has this, capacity to dominate through complete and total deception and mental indoctrination. So that's, the battle that everybody who's concerned about the planet needs to engage in. Everybody has a part there.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just add my 3 cents to these questions. So for the first one, I think both of you made very good points, and I'll just add that there is to add to the point that there really is no reason to hide these kind of papers also speaks to the reliance on a reality for the warmongers, so-called foreign policy makers, the blob, as Mark Sloboda would call it, the deep state, whatever you want to call it. But they really do rely on a reality that has most people in the United States, in the collective West, they're not, first of all, they're not tuned into Western mainstream media as much as maybe people like us are, because we are looking for the messages that are being sent, the truth behind the headlines. But a lot of people are not doing this because a lot of people are actually turned off by Western mainstream media, Western corporate media. They don't find it even worth reading. And this, it has been a dynamic that is so apparent in the United States, where the biggest viewers of Western mainstream media in the United States are people who are retired. The vast majority of the rest of the population isn't even really tuning in or getting their news from these sources. So they, whoever is citing these, the CIA analysts, the think tank experts, all of these people are really apart from most people's worldview, purview in how they digest information. So there's really going to be no concern from those who are making this policy, because they are relying upon people not paying attention to it at all, and also not interpreting it perhaps correctly. Hope maybe interpreting it is a good thing, because as you said, KJ, there is a huge campaign, a huge propaganda campaign, a huge misinformation campaign. You've also hit on, Brian, to make Russia, to make China, to make countries that are the targets of these policy papers to be seen as an enemy. So using big words and spinning a kind of message of war can be actually quite effective in that way. And we see that in the United States. Public opinion toward Russia and China are very, very low. It's very concerning. As for the Zelensky question, I mean, we can see how hard the United States, how hard the entire collective West works to keep this under wraps, how hard Ukraine works to keep this under wraps. They constantly say, no, it's not happening. His salary is only $260,000, which is a lot in Ukrainian terms. There's a lot of spinning to try to make it seem like there's no corruption happening. And that's because the United States is facilitating this corruption. Of course, Zelensky is profiting from this. The entire Ukrainian regime is profiting from the war, and who's not profiting is the rest of the people. So it's proven in the sense that Zelensky said during, I don't know if you remember this, guys, Zelensky said during that disastrous meeting with Trump, that theatrical disastrous meeting that happened earlier in the year, where he said something like, oh no, the money given to us was a grant. It wasn't a kind of loan to pay back. There really is nothing to pay back, because Ukraine will never ever be able to pay anything back, because what's happened to that money is it's either gone straight to the war, so Ukrainians can die in the million plus, or it's gone to some black market, the forces that are dominating and controlling this conflict, the oligarchs, the major corporations, they're all just eating it up. And this is what happens all of the time in proxy wars like this that the US and the West are heading. So Zelensky is definitely likely profiting from this, but it's a much bigger problem than even Zelensky. And I just want to say one last thing, and you two can definitely respond to this, because Brian, you said something earlier to the effect of, the multipolar world needs to prepare even harder and do even more to assist other countries, maybe even those who are seeking to be a part of this multipolar world, to become more aligned, to get them on the same page. And what's interesting about this is that, and I agree with this to the extent that it is possible. And one of the big issues I see here is that China, Russia, but China in particular, if we just focus on it, really stays very true to a policy of non-interference, which, in my estimation, and I have a different take on this, that I see it as positive, really actually sets an example. So where China and Russia can't really control what happens inside of countries. They can't, when a government isn't aligned, it's very risky to, for example, support forces that are, let's say, outside of the government. That carries with it all kinds of implications. So when governments aren't really aligned with this project, China and Russia, we went over the submarine exercises, the military exercises, the talks. We didn't even talk about the Putin-Xi talks, the SEO summit, the BRICS summit, all these things. When they lead this, I think, and there are tangible results, I think it does send a positive message to people in other countries that perhaps there is another world that is possible, and hopefully that leads to an evolving situation that is more favorable to the multipolar world. And I wanted to bring this up because there are a lot of people, KJ and I have been racking our heads with people who are, and that certainly isn't the point you're making, Brian, but a lot of people say China needs to do more on Gaza. China needs to do more on Gaza, needs to do more to save the Palestinian people. And I share the emotional sentiment that a lot more needs to be done around the world to stop what is happening to Palestinians, to stop that genocide that is the U.S. and Israel's making. But I want to point out the RAND Corporation, speaking these truths as we were talking about, these kind of think tanks often are just telling the truth about a situation. So while people are saying that China is doing absolutely nothing to help the Palestinians, I would argue, and I'm writing a chapter about this for a forthcoming book I'm contributing to, that China is actually doing what is possible. And this is not only having a positive effect on the world situation, but it is also infuriating the United States' military brass, the hegemonists. And look at just the last paragraph here. As with the Ukraine war, China's posturing as a Middle East peacemaker lacks credibility due to its one-sided stance. Beijing cannot expect its rhetoric to be taken seriously when it's so cavalier with its principles. So while a lot of people are saying that China is not doing enough, for example, for the Palestinian people, the U.S. actually, the ruling class, they don't actually believe this. They actually see things like diplomacy, like condemning what the U.S. and Israel are doing in Gaza at the UN, the Beijing Declaration that was signed, the fact that China upholds the right of Palestinian people to resist with arms. All of these things are seen as a big problem, and they would like to see that go away. So I just want to add that to the perspective of, to me, it's all about what's possible, because there's a lot that cannot be controlled, but it seems the example that the multipolar world can bring will hopefully continue to push things, and hopefully things like Palestine and Palestinian resistance will eventually be victorious and be able to lean on the multipolar world once it gets there. But any final reactions from both of you before we head out?
Yeah, I'll say that, this is a very important issue. And the thing is that the Chinese are looking to create a different world relationship. They don't want a world where everything is win-lose and it's essentially, the law of the jungle, might makes right. And so in order to implement that, they're trying as best as they can inside an extraordinarily flawed system to adhere to international law. And so, for example, if you look at the Genocide Convention is written, and this is a flaw in the Genocide Convention, but it's written so that it mandates countries to prevent and punish genocide in their countries, institutions and individuals who are responsible for genocide. And it's very clear. It defines what genocide is, and then it defines the actions that must be taken, and it defines who should be targeted. And it specifically mentions individuals and institutions. So, for example, Israel is under the mandate to prevent the genocide right now. It should be punishing everybody who is involved, but it's not, for obvious reasons, because it's the agent of it. But people are saying that there's a corporate lawyer who pretends to be an expert on international law, and he says, well, they are parties to the Genocide Convention, and therefore they are mandated to take action against other states that are committing genocide. That's actually not true. The Genocide Convention says if you want state-to-state intervention, it has to go through the United Nations. This is Clause 8 of the Genocide Convention. And so what you do is you use the UN as part of the process of reining in and preventing genocide. Now, currently, admittedly it's not working. So there's something terribly flawed with that system. But the thing is, you don't revert to vigilante justice, which is what a lot of people are talking about. They say, to hell with whatever, just go in, use military force. That's the end of the story. And if you do that, you're going to create, it's hard for people to understand this, but you're potentially creating that is even more deadly than the catastrophic genocide that is happening right now. Let me give you a very quick example. In 1948, the South Koreans and the Americans started to do a genocide of all the people who were living in Jeju Island. Now, it's a small island, but they started to wipe everybody out. They set the entire island on fire. They're putting people into concentration camps and killing them in mass graves. And the question that people sometimes ask is, why didn't the North Koreans intervene? Why didn't they intervene to prevent this genocide? And it happened, it continued for about 2 years until somewhere between 1/5 to 1/3 of the population was wiped out. I refer to it as Gaza with snow. They were completely wiped out. Now the question is, why did North Korea wait? Their compatriots in North Korea wait years before they intervened? Well, the answer is obvious, because when they did intervene, the US unleashed a genocide on the entire peninsula. And so instead of, tens of thousands, 80,000 people killed on Jeju Island, what you saw was 4 million people killed on the Korean peninsula. That's not a satisfying answer, because we're seeing people starve to death right before our eyes. But we also have to understand that there are incredible risks involved when you directly challenge a nuclear superpower, 2 nuclear superpowers that are literally going insane. So the answers are not satisfying. They're not simple.
Nope.
But there is a way that people can do something to prevent the genocide. And that is to put direct pressure on the governments that are responsible for the genocide. That means the United States, that means the UK, that means Germany, that means all the Western countries that are funding, sending weapons, financing this genocide. And actually, it is not an Israeli genocide. It is an American genocide. It's simply a continuation of an endless stream of genocides that the West has conducted. And the Israelis are simply the attack dog. You're misguided if you think all you have to do is cut the tail off the attack dog. It's not going to happen that way. You go after the attack dog, the owner is going to shoot you. And these are the risks that are involved. So what's really important is the people of the global West, who are the citizens of these genocidal governments, have to do everything that is humanly possible to rein in their governments and to prevent this continued destruction and this continued supplying of weapons, intelligence, etc. There are some very clear points of pressure. We know that the data centers are run by US tech companies. We know the AI targeting is done by US tech companies. We know that the weapons all come from the United States. We know that all of these things are directly served and supported by US corporations and US tax dollars. So that is where direct pressure can be applied. And so people have to think creatively about how can we put direct pressure on that. Of course, we can also talk about, strikes or, interfering, having strikes at the ports. All of these things are factors. But the thing that gets you nowhere is to start to blame it on China. That's part of the propaganda. Where they think
so ridiculous. Sorry, continue. It's just that I only want to spend a few more minutes on this before we head out. But KJ, finish your point. Then I'll say something, and Brian, I want to get you in here too. But it's been actually driving me crazy. So continue. Sorry.
I mean, the thing is that China has been doing a lot. It's just people don't realize what it's been doing. So, for example, the vast majority of people, a lot of them who are outraged around Palestine, if you're being outraged and this is a new thing to you, if this is new news to you, you probably got that information from TikTok. TikTok, which is owned by the Chinese company Douyin, is the first social media company that broke that wall of silence, that wall of omerta, that wall of erasure and mystification that all the other social media companies put out there. Well, you didn't get your information about Palestine from Facebook or Instagram. It's not possible. If you got correct information about Palestine, it was probably from TikTok. So already it was a Chinese-owned corporation that set the ground for people to start to understand and start to really think about what the issues were. And then we also know that, for example, Ansar Allah is connected to Beidou. That's how they get their targeting information. People who think that Yemen is doing incredible things, well, actually, they are able to do that because they get targeting information from Beidou. Another thing is that one of the largest, people say, why don't they sanction? Well, China does trade with every country, and it's actually a tiny, tiny amount relative to the global amount that China does trade with Israel. The EU and the United States are the biggest trade partners of Israel. So people who say anything else don't know what they're talking about. But one of the biggest exports of Israel is blood diamonds. It's 23% of its export market. And what China has done is it's done through skill technology. It's essentially wiped out Israel's blood diamond market. That's a huge impact on Israeli finances and certainly a huge impact on the Israeli military budget. And so there are all of these things that China is doing, and it's doing everything it can within the boundaries of international law and without violating, the norms of what of the ideals of a kind of multipolar system that is rule bound. And I think that is important, but people don't seem to understand that, and they're just shrieking. The people who are the citizens of the governments that are actually perpetrating the genocide are saying, you should do something. The third party, it's like the rapist saying, to the bystander, why don't you stop me? You have to stop me. It's your fault if you don't stop me from raping.
Yeah. And I'll just make a few quick points, Brian, and then I'll let you have it. I just want to say, people, look, everyone, especially in the collective West, in the United States in particular, there's so many people who are, of course, understandably, very emotionally distraught, disheartened, and feeling powerless, incredibly powerless, because people in the United States, no matter how much they protest, no matter how much they oppose something, are not seeing it end. The United States government, the United States military, the powers that exploit, so to speak, they are not ceasing their support for Israel, because Israel is really theirs. That they see that they're completely aligned, and they'll never let go of that leash unless it is forced to be severed. And the only people that can do that, China can't do that, Russia can't do that. The only people that can do that are the people living within the countries that are holding that leash. And I also want to bring up a couple of points that, KJ, you raised so many things. I just want to bring up a couple of points. One, this is what really just drives me crazy about this argument, is that not only do people not see that China is doing what it can within the bounds and limits that won't completely destabilize things and make things even worse, but people aren't even recognizing that if you are in the collectivists, if you were in the United States, then your guide should be the Palestinian resistance. Palestinian resistance should be your guide to what should the resistance to all this, the resistance to Israel in the region, in Palestine and beyond, what do they think about things? Yemen, you brought up Yemen, KJ. Yemen does not see China as a party to the genocide. It doesn't. If it did, their ships would not be moving through the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. They would not be. So if you say Yemen is the only heroic country, why is it that Yemen views China as not a party to the genocide? I haven't heard one statement from any Palestinian resistance organization, Hamas, the PFLP, whoever it is, that has said China is not doing enough. So if the Palestinian resistance isn't saying it, then why are we saying it? We're the ones whose responsibility is to ensure that our government is stopping this, or that we are stopping our government from doing this, because let's be honest, we're not going to, the government is totally aligned with this. And then lastly, we have to be historical about this. When in history has a country that is still resisting imperialism, colonialism, is still resisting this actively, no matter how powerful it is? The Soviet Union was a very powerful country. It was. But the Soviet Union did not blockade anybody. It didn't blockade Israel. It didn't blockade South Africa during apartheid. And you might say, oh, well, that is just unprincipled of it. But the Soviet Union did other things. China is doing other things. The Soviet Union aided struggles where it could, aided countries where it could. China is doing a similar thing in a completely different context. And even the most heroic examples, I bring this up now all the time, Quito Cuanavale, the Solidarity, Cuba sent hundreds of thousands of people to Angola, Zambia, to fight against the South African apartheid regime. It only did that when South Africa was on the ropes, when there was a possibility of victory. No country is going to make sacrifices against themselves without the possibility of victory. And you might say, oh, well, Yemen is doing it. Again, every historical trend and truth has outliers, but the overall general historical trend is that you're going to see support and solidarity where it is possible. And we need to not move the goalposts and say, China's not doing anything for anybody, Russia's not doing it, or anything like this. Contradictions are going to exist. We have to just deal with them better. Rather than look at China as the problem here, we need to move the focus back to where it really should be. But Brian, do you have any thoughts on this before we head out of here?
Yeah, I agree with both of your points. I just want to build on it and say this is about reality. Reality doesn't care about your emotions or how badly you want something. It only cares about what is and isn't possible. China has a huge population it has to take care of. It has the U.S. military literally occupying its territory. There are U.S. troops on Taiwan. That is Chinese territory. The U.S. has tens of thousands of troops stretched all along its periphery, all across the Asia-Pacific region. It's meddling in countries all along its periphery. It has a war raging in Myanmar right on China's borders, murdering Chinese engineers in Pakistan, working on the China-Pakistan economic corridor there. So what do you want China to do? Do you want them to send their whole army to the Middle East to go invade and fight a war with Israel? You want them to blockade Israel when they don't even have enough ships to deal with the US right off their own coast? Is that what you want? It doesn't. These people don't ever stop and ask, is it even possible? They say the same thing about why doesn't China just send its army to Syria? It literally doesn't have the strategic airlift or sea lift capability to move its military like that. People take for granted America's ability to move its troops all around the world. China doesn't have these capabilities. Its military is designed to protect China, as all militaries should be. It does not even have the physical capability to do the things people demand of it. Then they say, why is it trading with any of these countries? Why does China talk to the Israeli government? Why does Russia talk to the Israeli government? It's the same reason they talk to the Turkish government or any of these other governments. A country is not just the current administration. It's millions of people, all kinds of interests. If you close off yourself from an entire country, you surrender all leverage you might have over it, both in the present and also in the future. Think of this as a long-term strategy game. It is not about emotions and immediate reactions. If you do that in a game of chess, you will lose every single time because your opponent will bait you emotionally force you to react. They will know that you will react when they stir you up, and they will win every single time. And it works the exact same way in geopolitics. Again, I don't know what people want from Russia or China. I don't know what they expect them to do. Realistically, they are, as you guys say, they're already doing everything that is possible. And again, you have to remember, as KJ pointed out, Israel is the proxy of the United States. People imagine that this stunted, fake country created in the middle of the desert with only 10 million people, 100% dependent on the U.S. for absolutely everything. All of its munitions, bombs, every bomb it drops on Gaza came from the United States. So how are they controlling the entire U.S.? People don't even have reality sorted out, let alone what within the realm of reality can be done to solve this problem. Now, people were talking about BDS, boycott, divest, sanction, but they're obsessed with Jews and Israel. They don't understand that it's a proxy of the United States. So you need to look at the most powerful corporate financier interests in the U.S. Corporations you probably give your money to every single month. You need to cut yourself off from them. But when I say that, no more Starbucks, no more Apple, no more Netflix, no more Amazon, people recoil at that because now it requires personal sacrifice from them. They demand China to go do something, but they won't even give up their latte at Starbucks. So there's contradictions everywhere, including within the minds of people who demand all of this action. But are they themselves capable of action, but refuse to do so for their own personal reasons? So it's a big tangled mess. Some people in the comment section are confused about what we're even talking about. I've actually seen these people. I suspect it might even be some sort of psyop because it's so bizarre to sit there and blame China and Russia.
And it's come up quite suddenly. It's almost like, oh, well, this is the right time to do this, when in fact, and again, completely divorced from history. Like the most successful boycotts, yeah, they you know what, when they happened, just look at the South Africa example. Was it the global South that led that thing? No, it wasn't. Actually, it was when the apartheid regime was on the ropes, and people in the U.S., people in the West said, "Oh no, we can't tolerate this. We're going to hit the corporate interests, as you said, Brian, that are facilitating this." So again, responsibility. Whose is it? Not it. You can't expect countries that are literally trying to exist within the current world order, build a new one out of it, to lead that for you. That's not how it's going to be. So we got to take responsibility. That's why we have programs like ours. That's why we do what we do. But let's close this up. Unless KJ, you have one last point that you want to make. Yes.
One last statement. If you look at these people, they keep saying, all bystanders must do something. It is morally inexcusable to be a bystander. But then when you ask them why they don't do anything directly about their governments, the Western governments that are literally and directly financing and supporting the genocide, they'll say something like, well, I'm a bystander. My government is psychopathic and I'm a bystander. I can't do anything about them. And so they don't understand the contradiction in that position. They don't understand that they are actually the agents or the funders or directly responsible. Instead, they claim that they are bystanders to a psychopathic government, when actually they're at the same time demanding that other bystanders who have absolutely nothing to do with the situation intervene. So that's the core contradiction. And I like that, Brian pointed out, the real misunderstanding, and it's a really important thing to understand, is that this is not an Israeli genocide. It's an American genocide. People are confusing the little I for the big I. The little I villain is Israel, but the real villain is the big I. It's imperialism. And they have to understand that this is an imperial genocide. It's an American genocide. It's one of a long string of genocides that the West, the empire, always uses to have its way. And you have to understand that reality. Once you understand that reality, then you can start taking responsibility. And then you can start to take meaningful action. And as I've said before, there is meaningful action that can be taken. Go after the corporations that are literally facilitating the mass massacre of individuals. You can figure that out, and you can challenge them. There are things that can be done, but of all the things that can be done, maybe 150, ranks down is maybe calling in for, others to get intervene. But in the meantime, you need to do what you can do against your government, which is directly responsible. I think that's the key thing to understand. And I agree that I think that this is a psyop. I really believe that this is a psyop, because for years and years, the Americans, the US media was saying China is committing a genocide in Xinjiang. Well, there's no such thing. It's absolute nonsense. It's completely ridiculous. The population has multiplied in multiples. But when a real genocide started to happen and people started to see it through the mediation of a Chinese-owned corporation, TikTok, then they started to understand the distinction between fake and real genocide. And so then the next pivot has been with, some very, very suspect characters. They say, well, China is responsible for this genocide. Why? Because it's not preventing it. It's an absurd argument, but I believe that it is a psyop, and it's designed to manufacture consent for war. Certainly to delegitimate China, make people hate China, and make people think, it's in their minds. And I see this already in comments everywhere. The Chinese are responsible for this, and let's go to war. That's what's being set up in this situation.
And Danny, just one last thing I want to throw in there. People have to first, they have to understand that Israel is a U.S. proxy, and then they have to understand the role that proxy plays, and that is as the designated villain. They are deliberately doing things to outrage, to get an emotional reaction out of people, and to force people to short circuit their long-term strategic thinking with short-term emotional reactions. And it is working. It is working on a massive scale. Tens, if not hundreds of millions of people do just simply react to everything Israel does. And I see even in the comment section here, and I get it all the time on my channel, oh, Jews run everything, as if white people aren't capable of, haven't been responsible for centuries of imperialism, exploitation, mass murder, the conquest, destruction, and extinction of entire civilizations. And they think that this can only be because of the Jews taking over and running everything. No, white Western civilization has been doing this for centuries, and they're continuing to do it. And you're allowing them to shift this off onto the Jews as if they're solely responsible. It's not as if there aren't people who claim to be Jewish, just as people claim to be Christian, aren't deeply involved in Western imperialism. But to sit there and say it's just them, and I see a lot of white supremacists especially apply this argument because they want to relieve themselves of responsibility and shift it off onto someone else. And that's the whole point of keeping a proxy like Israel or Ukraine or Taiwan around. You get them to create the provocation, take responsibility, and absorb retaliation, and you get off scot-free. That is the whole point of this. And when you react to it emotionally without thinking or taking long-term strategic thought in mind, then you're doing their bidding. You are reacting and being manipulated by them, for them, and you're undermining your own cause by doing so.
And Israel is not. Israel will never be hurt by that, because, as you say, stop the United States, you stop Israel. That is the problem. That is the problem. Stop the United States, you stop Israel, because as you outlined, Brian, that is the actual social relationship we are working here. That is how you stop Israel. Stop the United States, you stop Israel. That should be what is in our mind, because anything else, just people are not gaming these scenarios. Anything else is not is actually not going to help it. And it just floors me that there's this expectation that China must take responsibility for this, when in reality China is already fighting a war for its own defense against the United States. Russia is doing this. Multipolarity is fighting a war and Palestine is a big part of this. So the best way to address this is to get to the root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem is the United States' war machine. Stop that, and you stop Israel. And mind you, China's responsibility to stop the war machine only lies at this moment, and it does everything it can with its economic development, with what's possible. It's not it is not going to go militarily on the offensive. It wants to build things, and it wants to build this new world. It is not going to put itself in a position where it must confront the United States, which no matter what it does to Israel, that's going to happen. Just understand this. Everyone has to understand that any action, if you don't think that the United States will do everything to protect Israel, you haven't been watching the last 2.5 years, or how about the last 40, 50, post 67 years? You haven't watched it, because hell, USS Liberty, the United States literally let its own people get killed because they didn't do anything about Israel doing that. They didn't do anything. Why would you say that? Oh, it's controlled by Israel. No, it just sees Israel as more valuable than the USS Liberty crew. That's the reality. So if you don't believe it'll do everything to protect Israel, you haven't been paying attention. So that's our problem. But anyway, all right, guys. Brian, KJ, Jotai Bangla, this was great. That's a little bit Chinese. Everybody, hit the like button as you head out of here. I'm live again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, so very soon, actually. So we got to go. 2 p.m. Eastern, Jeffrey Sachs. I have a couple other guests, Che Bose and Patrick Henningsen, coming on after that. 2 p.m. Eastern, it all begins. Save the time, date. Make sure you are following KJ and Brian. I'm going to put those links in the video description right now as we head out of here. At the like button, go to the video description to find all the places where both Brian and KJ and this work. With all that said, everybody, bye-bye.